Egypt's impact on later cultures was immense. You could say that Egypt provided the building blocks for Greek and Roman culture, and through them influenced all of the Western tradition. So today, Egyptian imagery, concepts, and perspectives are found everywhere. You'll find them in architectural forms, on money, and in our day-to-day lives. Many cosmetic surgeons, for example, use the silhouette of Queen Nefertiti, whose name means the beautiful one has come, in their advertisements. This introduction is going to provide you with the primary filters to view and understand ancient Egypt. Longevity. Ancient Egyptian civilization lasted for more than 3,000 years and showed an incredible amount of continuity. So that is more than 15 times the age of the United States. So considering how often our culture shifts, especially when we think about less than 15 years ago, there was no Facebook, there was no Twitter, there was no YouTube. That's a long time, 3,000 years, for no change to be happening in art. For the artworks to completely stay the same, the drawings, the paintings, the sculptures, etc. While today we consider the Greco-Roman period to be in the distant past, it should be noted that Cleopatra's reign, which ended in 30 BC, is closer to that of our own time than it was to the construction of the pyramids of Giza. It took humans nearly 4,000 years to build anything taller than those great pyramids. A vast amount of Egyptian imagery, especially royal imagery, that was governed by decorum, which is a sense of what was appropriate at the time, remained consistent throughout its history. This is why, especially to the untrained eye, Egyptian art appears extremely static. And in terms of symbols, gestures, and the way the body is rendered, it kind of was. It was intentional. The Egyptians were aware of this consistency. They viewed it as stability, divine balance, and clear evidence of the correctness of their culture. Hierakonpolis is an early stage of development of Egyptian funerary customs and of Egyptian art. It can be seen in the wall painting from Hierakonpolis. Made around 3200 BC, this design is primitive in character. At the time this mural was produced, Egypt was learning the use of bronze tools. The country is assumed to be ruled by a number of local sovereigns, which are not too far removed from the status of tribal chiefs. You can see fight scenes here that probably reflect local wars and raids. So out of this emerged two rival kingdoms, Upper and Lower Egypt. The struggle between them ended when Upper Egyptian kings conquered Lower Egypt, and they combined the two realms. One of these kings was King Narmer, who will appear in the next slide. The Palette of King Narmer celebrates victory over Lower Egypt. This could be the oldest historic work of art found. It shows this historic story, and it's no longer primitive, and it shows the features of late Egyptian art. The fact that we can read the scenes, kind of figure out what they mean, means that we left prehistoric art behind. The meanings made clear by hieroglyphic labels and visual symbols, which convey precise messages. It's a very disciplined design, and in it, Narmer has seized a fallen enemy, and you can see that by him grabbing the enemy by the hair, and he's about to slay him with a mace. Two more defeated enemies are seen at the bottom compartment on the left. We can also see a falcon, which stands for the god Horus, and to Narmer's left, you can see a sandal carrier who is holding the king's sandals. On the other side of the palette, we see the decapitated bodies of prisoners. The earliest royal monuments, such as the Narmer palette, which was carved around 3100 BC, it displays identical royal costumes and poses as those seen on much, much later rulers. We can see that in this presentation right here. The palette of Narmer, it's a close-up on the left, and on the right, this is Ramses III All right, on the right. Now you can see the headdress is the same, the pose is the same. So from 3000 BC to about 1100 BC, not much has changed. When talking about Egypt, let's talk briefly about geography. Egypt is a land of duality and cycles in its culture, in its topography. Geography is almost entirely rugged. There's a lot of barren desert, but on each side of the Nile, there is an explosion of green land. Um, the Nile River emerges from far to the south, deep in Africa, and empties into the Mediterranean Sea in the north, after spreading from a single channel into a fan-shaped system known as a delta. Um, the influence of this river on Egyptian culture and development cannot be overstated. Without its presence, the civilization would be entirely different and most likely entirely elsewhere. The Nile provided not only a constant source of life-giving water, but created a fertile land that fed the growth of this unique culture. So we're talking about pharaohs. They're not just kings. Kings in Egypt were complex intermediaries that straddled the terrestrial and divine realms. They were obviously living humans, but once they became in power on the throne, they also embodied the eternal office of kingship itself, the Ka, the spirit of kingship, which is kind of otherworldly. This divine aspect of the office of being a king, a pharaoh, gave authority to that human figure, that ruler. Supreme authority. The living king was associated with the god Horus, the powerful. He's a falcon-headed god, and he was believed to bestow the throne to the first human king. Horus's immensely important father, Osiris, is the lord of the underworld. One of the original divine rulers of Egypt, this deity embodied the promise of regeneration. He was cruelly murdered by his brother Seth, the god of the chaotic desert. Osiris was revived through the potent magic of his wife, Isis. Through her knowledge and skill, he was able to sire the miraculous Horus, bring him to life, and he avenged his father and threw his criminal uncle off the throne to take his rightful place. Osiris became ruler of the realm of the dead, the eternal source of regeneration in the afterlife. Deceased kings were identified with this god, creating a cycle where the dead king fused with the divine king of the dead, and his successor defeated death to take his place to the throne as Horus. Classical antiquity, or ancient Greece and Rome, is a period about 900 years in span. When ancient Greece and then ancient Rome, first as a republic and then as an empire, dominated the Mediterranean area. From about 500 BC to about 400, we tend to lump ancient Greece and Rome together because the Romans adopted many aspects of Greek culture when they conquered the areas of Europe under Greek control. So these two sculptures here on the right show the influence of Egyptian art into Greek art. We can see that in their poses. They're stoic figures. They're very similar to Egyptian statues, the ones on the left, of Pharaoh Mycerinus and his wife. We talked about that in the last presentation. The beginning of Greek art pretty much copied Egyptian art, and it's clearly seen here. So the formative phase of Greek civilization embraces about 400 years, from about 1100 to 700 BC. Of the first 3 centuries, we know very little, but around 800 BC, the Greeks emerge in the full light of history. For example, the Olympic Games in 776, and the geometric style that Greece is known for came about during this time as well. It started on small sculpture and pottery. Large architecture and sculpture doesn't appear until the 7th century. So in this little illustration, lots of Greek pottery here and terms for it. Continuing with some Greek pottery, here we look at the Diplon vase, which is decorated with geometric and figurative designs. Vases such as these are covered in rows of patterns and shapes, which is typical of the geometric movement, and identified with Greek art. But more importantly, they include scenes of funerary practices with depictions of humans and animals. You can see that at the handle level. The most common scenes are of the lying down of a corpse and a corpse procession with mourners on each side of it. And we can see that in the detail on the right. In many representations, one row is used to show the deceased flanked by mourners. There's sacrificial animals around, while on a second row, you see chariots, horses, warriors. So these are made with using a black figure technique. Each human consists of a triangle for a torso, a circle for a head, lines for the arms, and carved sections for the legs. They all provide a rather basic profile. In order to make their appearance recognizable, each figure is also given a sort of forward-facing position. It can be seen in the way the figures are lying down. They're propped up on their sides. So indeed, the idea of perspective became an issue when trying to represent a lot of things in the designs of these vases. Pretty non-existent perspective. The shrouds used to put over the deceased are represented as patterned veils, painted literally above the lying down figures, rather than over them, so we can kind of see everything. Also, there are horses painted beside each other. Their legs are all put in the same plane, showing that artists were still experimenting and demonstrating concepts like dimension and relative placement. Shapes are put in to fill an empty space, and these scenes and the rest of the areas in the vases are also filled with rows of repetitive design, an elemental type in the geometric movement. So talking about Greek art, we have to talk about gods and goddesses. For example, the Romans adopted the Greek pantheon of gods and goddesses, but changed their names. The Greek god of war was Ares, whereas the Roman god of war was Mars. The ancient Romans also copied ancient Greek art. However, the Romans often used marble to create copies of sculptures. The Greeks had originally made them in bronze. So the major shift in sculpture from Egyptian art to Greek and Roman art is movement. At first, that first sculpture, pretty stoic, but right after that became a renaissance of movement. Egyptian sculpture of the body was very stiff, as I said, while Greek art, followed by Roman art, is more of a study of the body and movement. They liked athletic contrapposto poses showing action. When I say contrapposto, that means the standing human figure is poised such as the weight rests on one leg, called the engaged leg, freeing the other leg, which is bent at the knee. So with that weight shift, the hips, shoulders, and the head tilt, it suggests a relaxation with the subtle internal organic movement that denotes life. You can see life in these because of that movement, because of one leg resting and one leg in motion, and the body moved in such a way. Contrapposto may be also used for draped as well as nude figures. The Greeks invented this formula in the early 5th century BC as an alternative to this stiff, static pose. In those stiff, static poses, the weight was distributed equally most of the time on both legs. In earlier periods, there was a clear development from the Critias boy of the 5th century, whose leg is bent while his torso remains erect, to the completely relaxed 4th century pictures of sculptures, etc. The ones that we're looking at kind of now. Here we see the dying Niobe, meaning about 440 BC. According to a legend, Niobe had humiliated the mother of Apollo and Artemis by boasting that her 7 children, her 7 daughters, and her 7 sons were superior. So in revenge, the 2 gods killed all of her children and shot her in the back with an arrow while running. In this sculpture, you see the anguish of her trying to get that arrow out of her back, and in doing so, her clothing slips off. So the artist's main goal was to display the beautiful female body, and this is the earliest known large female nude in Greek art. It shows this emotion, this anguish, this experience of suffering that she went through. It's such a human feeling, and you could see that through her expression, through the way her body is contorted. The ancient Greeks were the first Western culture that believed in finding rational answers to the great questions of earthly life. They assumed that there were constant laws which govern the universe, how the stars move, the materials that compose the universe, mathematical laws that govern harmony and beauty, geometry, and physics. Both the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans had enormous respect for human beings and what they could accomplish with their minds and their bodies. They were humanists, which is a frame of mind which was reborn in the Renaissance. This was very different from the period following classical antiquity, the Middle Ages, when Christianity, with its sense of the body as sinful, came to dominate Western Europe. So when you imagine ancient Greek or Roman sculpture, you might think of the figure that is nude, athletic, young, idealized, with perfect proportions. And this is true of ancient Greek and classical art of this period, as well as ancient Roman art. When we study ancient Greek art, so often we are looking at ancient Roman art, or at least their copies of ancient Greek sculpture, or paintings and architecture as well. Basically, just about every Roman wanted ancient Greek art. For the Romans, Greek culture symbolized a desirable way of life, of leisure, the arts, luxury, learning. The popularity of ancient Greek art for the Romans was extreme. Greek art became the rage when Roman generals began conquering Greek cities, beginning in about 211 BC. They returned triumphantly to Rome, not with the usual booty of gold and silver coins, but with works of art. This work so impressed the Roman elite that studios were set up to meet the growing demand for copies, destined for the villas of wealthy Romans. This one right here, Polykletos, is a Roman copy of a Greek original. It's one of the most sought after and most copied Greek sculptures. Bronze versus marble. For the most part, the Greeks created their freestanding sculptures in bronze, but because bronze is valuable, it can be melted down and reused. Sculpture was often recast into weapons. This is why so few ancient Greek bronze originals survive. That's why we have to mostly look at ancient Roman copies in marble of varying quality to try to understand what the Greeks achieved. The image we're looking at are Greek bronze statues found under the sea, preserved and found in 1972. We'll be watching a video on them later. The Riace bronzes were a pivotal find. To see a bronze figure in pristine condition like this was a big deal. So why sculptures are often incomplete or reconstructed? To make matters worse, Roman marble sculptures were buried for centuries, and very often we recover only fragments of a sculpture. So it has to be reassembled. This is the reason you'll often see that sculptures in museums include an arm or a hand that are modern recreations. Or that ancient sculptures are simply displayed incomplete, maybe missing an arm or a hand. The Pharaohs spear bearer in the Naples Museum is a Roman copy of a lost Greek original that we think was found largely intact in a Roman city named Pompeii. So the original statue was made in bronze. You'll see that idea on the left here. It's lost. This is a reconstruction. The canon. The idea of the canon is a rule of standard of beauty developed for artists to follow. It wasn't new to the ancient Greeks. The ancient Egyptians also developed a canon. And centuries later, during the Renaissance, Leonardo da Vinci investigated the ideal proportions of the human body with his Vitruvian Man. So here in this slide, we'll see the development of the Egyptian canon on the left. So what they did here was they created a grid. So that's why all the figures in Egyptian art looked the same. They were all the same amount of squares high and wide. Now we can look in the middle here and we see some Greek statues. Now the canon in Greek was 7 heads high was a typical man. So that's why if you put 7 of a sculpture's heads stacked on top of one another, you'll get the height of that sculpture. Now on the right here, we see Leonardo da Vinci's study of a man here. So the ideal male nude has remained a staple of Western art. We're going to see that throughout our class. It's a staple of Western art and culture, and to this day is represented in that way. For example, we're looking at Robert Mapplethorpe. He's a photographer, showing the complexities and the beauty of the male body. When talking about ancient Greek and Roman art, we have to mention the classical orders of columns. The first slide here is the Doric order, and it's the earliest of the 3 classical orders of architecture. It represents an important monument in Mediterranean architecture, when big monumental construction made the transition from small impermanent materials like wood to permanent materials, namely stone. The Doric order is characterized by plain, unadorned columns. Very simple. You can see here, just lined columns. The second is Ionic, and it's distinguished by a more slender column with a larger base. There are volutes on top. Volutes are scroll shapes, and that gives it a little bit more character than the Doric column. The last is the Corinthian. It's the most ornate. It has a very slender column, but the top is decorated with leaves and scrolls, and you can see in the detailed drawing here how ornate it is. So here's the Arch of Constantine. Arches were built to celebrate military victories. This arch is the first arch to celebrate history over a Roman rival, not a foreign enemy. The arch has relief sculpture with reliefs copied from other monuments, which is not usually typical, especially in arches. On top, we see 4 freestanding figures, and the rest are all reliefs or types of reliefs. Some are more shallow and some are high reliefs. Paintings from antiquity rarely survive. Paint, after all, is a much less durable medium than stone or bronze sculpture. But it is here thanks to the ancient Roman city of Pompeii, and here that we can trace the history of Roman wall painting. The entire city was buried in volcanic ash in 79 BC, when the volcano at Mount Vesuvius erupted. It preserved the rich colors of the paintings in the houses and monuments there for thousands of years until their rediscovery. These paintings represent an uninterrupted sequence of 2 centuries of evidence. This concludes my presentation on ancient Egyptian, ancient Greek, and ancient Roman art. It's just a snapshot of what was created. There was so much art, architecture, sculpture produced. It's hard to get an idea of it in one presentation, but here it is. And in your homework, in your 5 key question homework piece, you will have to choose one piece of artwork from either ancient Egyptian, ancient Roman, or ancient Greek art to talk about. Good luck. I'll see you next week. Thank you.